Life had a steady rhythm on my land. Mornings began with the pale gold of the sun spilling over the hills, the mist curling low in the hollows like it didn't want to let go of the night. I'd walk the property lines with a coffee in one hand, boots sinking into damp earth, listening to the crunch of gravel and the distant calls of crows. My land wasn't just a place to live. It was a piece of me, shaped by years of hard work, sweat, and quiet pride. Every fence post was hammered in by my own hands, every path worn by my own boots. The western side of the property had always been a bit of a no-man's land. It sloped down into a patch of thick brush and young pines, the sort of place where time felt slower. The ground there was uneven, dotted with rocks and shaded even in the summer. I rarely had a reason to go down that far to dense for farming. Too steep for building and far enough from the main house that it stayed out of sight. That patch was the kind of place you forget about until you need to check the fence. It was during one of those aimless fence checks that I noticed something different. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made your breath feel heavy, and a layer of frost clung to the edges of the grass. As I stepped through a tangle of wild blackberry vines, I caught sight of something that didn't belong. The land was supposed to open up into a clearing, but now the clearing wasn't empty. It was occupied. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. Through the trees, a small structure-weathered siding, tin roof, and smoke curling from a chimney sat snugly against the hill. I stood still, feeling that odd mix of confusion and disbelief. It wasn't a shed. It wasn't a hunting cabin. It was a house. Not new, but lived in, worn in that way where the grass around it is pressed flat. The path to the door is well-trodden, and there's a familiarity to the way it sits on the earth. I'd walked that land dozens of times over. The years, I'd never seen a house there before. The ground under my boots felt suddenly foreign, like I'd stepped somewhere I wasn't supposed to. My eyes traced the fence line, trying to remember exactly where the property boundaries ran. I'd inherited the place from my father, who had always been meticulous about those things. He'd walk the edges every spring, making sure nothing had shifted or been tampered with. But I realized I hadn't done the same nearly as often. I moved closer, cautious, pushing through the undergrowth. Every step made the situation feel stranger. There were tire tracks in the dirt, old but not ancient. The place had clearly been there for a while, paint peeling, wood darkened by seasons of rain and sun, but still standing strong. In front of the structure, a small vegetable patch lay dormant in the cold, its soil turned over and waiting for spring. A rusted wheelbarrow leaned against a fence post, the kind of tool that speaks of daily use. It wasn't some abandoned building. Someone lived there. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. This wasn't a forgotten cabin tucked in a corner of the county. This was on my land I'd paid taxes on, land I'd maintained, land I'd bled and sweated for. And somehow, right under my nose, a whole home had been sitting there, quietly existing without my knowledge. I pulled back into the trees, my heart beating slow but heavy. It wasn't fear so much as the shock of realizing how much can happen beyond your sight. 3 years, maybe more, of someone else making themselves comfortable on my soil. It was the kind of trespass that went beyond footprints or a stray deer. This was a stake in the ground. On the way back to the main house, the air felt colder. My boots crunched on frostbitten grass, but the sound barely registered over the noise in my head. Questions piled on each other. Who was living there? How had I not noticed before? Was the boundary wrong, or had someone simply decided my land was theirs to use? I couldn't shake the thought that this hadn't been an accident. You don't just wake up one day and realize your house is in the wrong spot. Whoever they were, they had settled in, built a life in that corner of the world without so much. As a knock on my door, I imagined the seasons rolling past while they planted their garden, stacked their firewood, and watched the sun set from a porch that didn't belong to them. As the day wore on, I kept finding my eyes drifting to the western tree line, half expecting to see smoke curling into the sky. The rest of my chores felt mechanical, my mind stuck in that frost-covered clearing. The smell of wood smoke had followed me all the way back, and it clung to my thoughts like the scent of something burned into fabric. That evening, I pulled out the old survey maps my father had kept in a leather folder. The paper was worn at the edges, the ink faded, but still legible. I traced the lines with my finger, following the angles and measurements that marked out the property. The boundaries were clear, meticulously documented, just as I remembered. And sure enough, that western slope, the patch of brush and pines, all the way to the clearing, it was mine. No question. There's a strange kind of quiet that settles over you when you realize your space has been invaded. Not in a moment of chaos, but slowly, quietly, over time. It's not the jolt of a kick-tin-der-ritz, the steady drip of something being taken without you even knowing. The night was still, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and distant smoke. Somewhere out there, past the pines and brush, someone was probably sitting by their fire, cooking their dinner, feeling entirely at home. On my land, and that's how it started, not with a shout, not with a confrontation, but with a simple walk and the sudden, unshakable knowledge that something wasn't right. It was a seed planted in the back of my mind, and I knew it was only going to grow. In the days that followed, the sight of that house in the clearing became a ghost that followed me everywhere. I'd be mending a fence or stacking wood, and my thoughts would drift westward, back through the pines, to where that tin roof glinted faintly through the branches. It was a presence I could feel even without seeing. My land had always felt like an extension of my own body, every hollow, every ridge, every bend in the creek familiar to me. But now there was a piece of it I couldn't touch without running into the reality of someone else's claim. I started noticing signs that had been there all along, but I'd been too trusting or maybe too busy to pay them any mind. The faint hum of an old generator on still mornings, just low enough to blend with the wind through the trees. Tracks worn into the dirt where no deer trail had ever been. Even the way some of my boundary fence posts leaned ever so slightly, like they'd been used as a backrest more than once. The strangest part was how natural it all looked, as if this arrangement had been in place for decades. Their vegetable patch had once been green, and full I could tell by the tilled soil and the faint ridges that still clung to its surface. Firewood was stacked with care against the side of the house, covered in an old tarp that flapped softly in the wind. There was a rhythm to the place, the kind that only comes from living somewhere day after day, season after season. That rhythm had played out undisturbed for years. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how long 3 years is when someone's making themselves at home. 3 springs of planting, 3 summers of watching crops grow tall, 3 autumns of harvesting and stacking wood, and 3 winters of sitting by a fire while snow blanketed the ground. All of it done on a piece of earth they had no right to. I pictured those seasons in my mind. In spring, the smell of damp soil and fresh grass drifting over the boundary. In summer, the sound of distant hammering or a lawnmower faintly carried on the breeze. In autumn, the smoke of a wood stove curling into the cool air. And in winter, the silence broken only by the creak of snow under boots. Boots that were wearing a path across my property line. There's a certain kind of audacity in living that way, knowing your foundation sits on ground that doesn't belong to you. It's not like squatting in an abandoned building in town. Out here, in the country, boundaries aren't just legal, they're personal. They're drawn with work and sweat and the kind of patience it takes to build something from nothing. A fence line isn't just wire and wood, it's a promise. A statement of where one man's responsibility ends and another's begins. The realization gnawed at me. It wasn't just about the land itself. though that was bad enough. It was about the quiet assumption, the unspoken claim. It was the thought that for years they must have believed I either didn't notice or didn't care. And maybe, in their minds, 3 years was enough to turn a trespass into something permanent. I began to recall little oddities from the past. A missing length of fencing wire I'd once written off as deer damage. A stack of firewood that had seemed smaller than I remembered cutting. Even a faint set of footprints I'd found near the western tree line one spring. Boots too large to belong to me and too heavy to be a hunter just passing through. Back then, they'd been isolated curiosities. Now they formed a pattern. I tried to imagine their mindset. Did they think they were safe from notice because the clearing was so far from my house? Did they convince themselves the land was abandoned, forgotten, ripe for the taking? Or did they know exactly whose property it was and simply decide that my ignorance was their opportunity? The thing about country living is that people tend to think distance means privacy. Maybe they thought if they stayed out of sight, they could stay out of trouble. And for 3 years, they were right. I hadn't been watching. I'd been tending to my own side of the fence, trusting that others were doing the same. But trust is a fragile thing, and once it's broken, you start seeing the cracks everywhere. As the weeks went on, I started keeping an unspoken watch on that patch of land. I wouldn't go all the way into the clearing, but I'd linger at the edges, just far enough to catch a glimpse of the place without being seen. I noticed small changes: the woodpile growing taller, a few new boards nailed to the porch railing, a fresh stack of hay bales covered with a tarp. It was like watching someone else's life unfold in time-lapse, except every frame was on my soil. What unsettled me most was how comfortable they seemed. Comfort takes time to build. It's not just about putting a roof over your head. It's about settling in, leaving little marks of yourself in the world around you. And they'd done that. My clearing bore the marks of someone else's living. Worn paths, planted rows, repaired fences, not to keep me out, but to keep their world contained. The land itself had begun to carry their fingerprints. The grass was cropped short in some places, trampled flat in others. Saplings that once stood tall had been cut back, likely for firewood. A pile of scrap metal sat near the tree line, the kind of collection that grows slowly over years of small projects. Even the air seemed to have changed, carrying with it the faint, familiar scent of habitation wood smoke, soil, and the unmistakable trace of livestock somewhere nearby. Every time I thought about it, I came back to the same point: 3 years. 3 years is enough time to plant an orchard and watch it bear fruit. It's enough time to raise a child from toddler to school age. It's enough time to turn a piece of land from unfamiliar ground into something you call home. And they'd done all of that on mine. The trespass wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, persistent, like a vine creeping along a fence post until it wraps the whole thing. And like a vine, it would keep going unless it was cut back. I didn't yet know how it would end, but I knew this much: they'd had 3 years without interference. That was about to change. It happened on a day that began like any other. The sun had barely crested the eastern ridge, throwing long, pale beams across the frost that still clung to the grass. I was stacking the last of the split firewood by the shed, the air so cold. It made each breath feel solid when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Vehicles didn't just wander up my drive. Out here, if someone showed up, it was intentional. I set down the armful of wood, dusted off my gloves, and turned toward the sound. A dark-colored pickup rolled to a slow stop in the clearing just past my front gate. Its paint was dulled with age but not neglect, the kind of truck that still carried a sense of pride in its upkeep. The door swung open, and out stepped a man I'd never seen before, though he carried himself like he owned the place. His clothes were clean but worn, boots scuffed from regular use. He didn't glance around in wonder like a visitor. My eyes went straight to me, like a man who'd come for business. In that instant, I knew he wasn't lost. He was here for something. The walk between us was deliberate, his boots leaving. A faint crunch in the gravel. He stopped a few feet away, standing square, the way a person does when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. His gaze shifted briefly toward my house before returning to me. I didn't speak. Out here, silence has its own weight, and it often draws the truth out faster than questions. He cleared his throat and started into his purpose, laying it out plain. No preamble, no small talk, just the claim. According to him, my house, the one that had stood here for decades, was sitting on his property. Not only that, but he said I would need to remove it, demolish it. He didn't suggest a sale, a trade, or a boundary adjustment. He said it like it was inevitable, like he was doing me a favor by letting me know before he brought in the authorities. It was a statement so bold, so untethered from the truth, that for a moment I almost wondered if I'd misheard. I looked past him toward the west. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. The man in front of me was tied to that house in the clearing. The trespasser wasn't just living on my land, he was now claiming part of it as his own. With the audacity to say that my home was the intrusion, the memory of those 3 years of silent encroachment rose up in my mind like a wave, each moment fitting neatly into the puzzle. The confidence in his tone, the way he carried himself as if the ground beneath him was already his. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated move. His words settled into the air like smoke, twisting into something that felt heavier. The longer it lingered, my father had set the foundation for my house himself, marking it in the old survey maps that still sat in my desk drawer. Those lines weren't suggestions, they were legal, permanent, and paid for with a lifetime of work. But here he was, standing on my driveway, telling me to tear down what had been mine long before he appeared. The sun shifted higher, casting sharper shadows across the yard. His face was steady, almost expressionless. The kind of look people wear when they believe they're in the right or want you to think they are. I didn't need to imagine what had fueled his confidence. 3 years of living undisturbed can breed a certain arrogance. In his mind, the house and the clearing had given him standing, a foothold. And maybe, just maybe, he thought I was the kind of man who'd rather fold than fight, who'd find it easier to give in than to dig through the mess this would cause. What he didn't know was that the land had a memory. Every acre of it was tied to the years my family had worked it. To him, it might just be a patch of dirt with a few trees. To me, it was the ground where my father had stood in the heat of summer, driving fence posts into place. It was the soil that had grown our first corn crop, the slope where my dog used to run after rabbits, the clearing where I'd stood as a boy. Learning how to read the lay of the land, he was asking me to erase all of that with the swing of a demolition crew's hammer. The breeze carried a faint whiff of wood smoke from the west, curling over the ridgeline like a reminder of what had been building for years. That smoke had once been just an oddity, a curiosity on the edge of my awareness. Now it was the scent of an open challenge. My eyes drifted toward the boundaries in my mind, the lines drawn not just on paper, but in memory. I thought about those survey maps, the neat, precise ink that spelled out exactly where my land began and ended. Those lines didn't care about trespass or arrogance. They were as real as the soil. Under my boots, the man's claim sat in the air like a bad taste. It wasn't just wrong, it was insulting. A demand like that wasn't rooted in misunderstanding, it was built on the hope that I'd back down. It was the kind of move that only works if the other person lets it. I said nothing, letting him fill the silence with more of his reasoning, though I wasn't listening to the words so much as the tone. There was no hint of doubt, no space for negotiation. This wasn't a neighborly discussion. This was a declaration the longer I stood there, the more certain I became of one thing. This wasn't just about a house or a plot of land. It was about the principle of ownership, about the quiet understanding that what's yours is yours because you've worked for it, cared for it, and defended it. As he finished his piece, he stood still, watching me like a man waiting for a verdict. But I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of an immediate reaction. Out here, words carry weight, and once they're spoken, you can't take them back. Instead, I let the quiet settle between us. Behind him, the road stretched back toward the west, toward that clearing where his own trespass stood like an unspoken confession. 3 years he'd been there, living in the shadow of the pines, and now he was standing on my doorstep, telling me to tear down my own home. The frost was starting to melt in thin rivulets along the gravel, water glinting in the pale sunlight. I watched it run downhill, slow and steady, carving a path without hurry, but with certainty. And in that moment, I knew whatever came next, it wasn't going to be quick. This wasn't the kind of fight you settled in a day. The day after the demand, I woke to a sky heavy with low gray clouds. The air carried that damp stillness that settles in before a rain, and the smell of wet earth drifted through the open kitchen window. I sat at the table with a cup of black coffee, staring at the folded leather-bound folder that held my father's survey maps. They had been sitting there since the day I'd first found the house in the clearing. But now they felt like more than just old papers. They were the backbone of what I was about to do. The folder creaked open, the sound as familiar as an old barn door. Inside, the maps lay in their protective sleeves, edges worn soft from years of handling. The inked lines were crisp, despite their age, every angle and measurement neatly labeled. My father had been meticulous, and seeing his handwriting in the margins brought a quiet steadiness to my mind. Each note he'd made, dates of inspections, fence repairs, and property corner verifications was a reminder that this land had been cared for with precision. I traced the western boundary with my fingertip, following the notations until I reached the exact spot where the house in the clearing would sit. No question about it, the land was mine. The legal descriptions matched perfectly to the terrain. Every call and bearing accounted for. There was no wiggle room for interpretation, but facts on paper weren't always enough. If the man who stood in my driveway thought he could claim my home sat on his property, he'd either been misled or was hoping to mislead me. The first step was to confirm what I already knew. I dug out the metal detector and post driver from the shed, loaded them in the truck, and headed to the western side. The dirt path toward the clearing was slick from the previous night's dew, tire ruts glistening in the dim morning light. As I walked the boundary line, I searched for the old survey markers' iron rods driven into the earth decades ago. They were the silent sentinels of property law, buried a few inches below the surface, but as firm in their position as the day they'd been set. The detector chirped faintly near the first corner. I dug with a small spade until metal scraped against steel, and there it was, the top of a weathered iron rod, capped with the same faded orange paint my father had used when I was a boy. I wiped it clean and stood, looking back toward the clearing. The line was clear as day in my mind, and the house sat well within at my side. My land. I spent the next several hours walking that boundary, finding each marker in turn. Some were buried deeper than others, but they were all exactly where they should be. By the time I'd finished, my boots were caked in mud, and my hands were chilled from the damp soil. But the work had given me something no argument could shake. Proof. Back at the house, I spread the maps across the kitchen table again and began matching the physical markers to the survey descriptions. Every measurement, every angle confirmed the same thing. The clearing and the house that didn't belong there was entirely on my property. my father's maps, my own inspection, and the county's recorded plats all told the same story. That evening, I made the drive into town to the county courthouse. The building had that quiet, stale air feeling that comes from decades of paper records stored within its walls. The clerk behind the counter handed me the large bound volume that contained the plat maps for my township. I flipped through the pages until I found my parcel, its boundaries drawn in thick, black ink. The numbers matched exactly to the ones. In my father's folder, I made copies of every thinker and plats, legal descriptions, and the historical surveys. I also requested adjoining property records, including the parcel owned by the man who'd come to my driveway. His land lay west of mine, beginning beyond the clearing and stretching toward the county road. The line between us wasn't vague. It was marked, recorded, and unchanging. His property never touched my house, not even close. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't a simple mistake. He had to know. Anyone who bought property in this county received the same packet of survey maps and descriptions I just reviewed. The house in the clearing wasn't even near his own home. Seetwee was tucked into my land like it had grown there by accident. But accidents don't come with gardens, stacked firewood, and 3 years of upkeep. When I left the courthouse, the rain had started, a slow, steady drizzle that made the roads shine like black glass. The wipers brushed rhythmically back and forth as I drove, and my mind settled into a quiet focus. I now had more than enough to disprove his claim. But I also knew a certain kind of man doesn't back down just because the facts say he's wrong. Over the next week, I gathered every piece of documentation I could find: rolled photographs of my father working near the western boundary, receipts for fence repairs along that line, even weathered Polaroids from my own youth where I stood in the clearing, fishing rod in hand. The same ground under my boots that now held his illegal homestead. I began keeping a written log of everything I observed near that corner of the property. Each time smoke rose from the clearing, each time I saw movement through the trees, I recorded the date and time. It wasn't paranoia, it was building a record. Something solid that could speak for itself if the matter ever found its way to court. One afternoon, I drove the perimeter again, this time with a small handheld GPS. The satellite coordinates matched the survey lines exactly, right down to the inch. Standing there with the beeping device in my hand, looking at the house through the screen of branches, I felt the weight of certainty. This wasn't a battle over interpretation. This was trespass, pure and simple. The truth about the land wasn't just written on paper, was carved into the soil, recorded in county archives, and backed by decades of living memory. And that truth was on my side. But knowing the truth and getting it respected are two different things. I could already imagine the ways he might twist the story, the stubbornness that might keep him from accepting what was plain. People get strange when they've convinced themselves of a claim, especially when they've built something on it. The rain kept falling as evening set in, drumming lightly on the tin roof of my shed. I stood at the edge of the yard, staring westward into the dark line of pines. Somewhere beyond them, the trespasser's chimney smoke was probably curling into the damp air. He didn't know yet that I'd walked every inch of that boundary, dug up every marker, and copied every recorded plat in the county. The facts were like the roots of an old oak deep, unmovable and ready to hold against any storm. The man in the clearing could make all the demands he wanted, but the land knew where it belonged, and soon enough he was going to learn the same thing. The days after my trip to the courthouse carried a different weight. The anger that had been sharp and hot when he first made his demand was now steady and cool, like a slow-burning coal. I had the truth, the proof, and the patience to use both. Out here, you learn that rushing into a problem often makes it worse. Better to let it ripen until the solution comes as naturally as the turning of the seasons. I didn't storm over to the clearing or shout across the fence. Instead, I kept my distance, walking the property as I always had, my pace unhurried. But each time I passed the western boundary, I took note of small details: the way his garden rows were tilled, the fresh pile of split logs under his tarp, the tire ruts cutting deeper into the dirt track. He was still living as though the land was his, unaware that the ground beneath him was about to shift. The first move was quiet. I made a trip to town, not to the courthouse this time, but to the office of a local surveyor I'd known for years. He was an old hand at the work, with a memory for boundaries sharper than the lines on a map. I handed him my father's survey, the GPS readings, and the county plat copies. Without hesitation, he agreed to come out and mark the property in a way that couldn't be ignored. 2 mornings later, we were walking the boundary with his tripod and range poles. The air was crisp, the frost crunching under our boots, and every time his instrument clicked into place, it confirmed what I already knew. The bright orange stakes he drove into the soil stood tall against the muted winter landscape, forming a clear, unbroken line that ran right through the clearing and squarely across the front of the trespasser's home. It's a strange thing, seeing a false claim cut in half by reality. From where I stood, the stakes were more than just plastic markers. They were the quiet voice of the law, speaking in inches and degrees. The next step was even quieter. I filed an official notice of encroachment with the county, attaching every survey, photograph, and historical record I'd gathered. I requested a formal hearing, knowing full well that once the paperwork was in motion, the man in the clearing wouldn't just be dealing with me, he'd be dealing with the county, the state, and the very system that recorded every acre of this land. I didn't deliver the news in person. I let the envelope stamped and certified carry my message for me. The law doesn't need raised voices to be heard. For the next week, I went about my life as usual. I chopped wood, repaired a section of the chicken coop, and hauled a load of hay from the feed store. But every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement through the trees in the direction of the clearing. He was working more frantically, now moving piles of scrap, covering things with tarps, even pulling up a section of his garden fence. It was the look of a man trying to prepare for something he couldn't stop. The county's timeline moved at its own pace, but I knew the weight of it was pressing on him. Officials came out to inspect the boundary, walking the same line I'd traced weeks before. They took their own measurements, made their own notes, and left without any fanfare. But their presence was enough. Out here, nothing draws attention like a government truck parked on a rural road. By the second week, I noticed the first signs of retreat. The smoke from his chimney became less frequent. The paths that once led from his door to the garden were now faint, the frost undisturbed. A trailer appeared one morning, hitched to the back of his truck, and over the next few days, it slowly filled with tools, lumber, and the kind of belongings a man doesn't leave behind when he knows he's moving for good. I didn't speak to him. I didn't need to. The stakes in the ground and the letters from the county said everything that needed saying. The law had drawn its line, and there was no arguing with it. One cold morning, just as the sun was starting to burn through the mist, I heard the low rumble of an engine echoing through the pines. I stepped out onto the porch and saw the dark-colored pickup heading down the dirt track toward the county road, the trailer behind it piled high. It moved slow, the way a man drives when he's carrying more than just his possessions. When the sound faded, the clearing was silent again. No smoke, no movement, just the stillness of winter settling over the land. Over the following days, I walked the western boundary more often. The house in the clearing stood empty, its windows dark, the garden rows lying dormant under the frost. It looked smaller now, shrunken without the presence of the man who had lived there. The tire ruts leading up to it were already softening, edges crumbling back into the earth. I didn't rush to tear it down. That wasn't the point. The point was that it was mine again, every acre, every inch, free of someone else's claim. The house could wait until spring, when the ground was firm and the days longer. For now, it stood as a quiet reminder of what happens when patience and proof do their work. Standing in the clearing one afternoon, I looked out at the line of bright orange stakes still marking the boundary. They caught the winter light like little flames, steady and unshaken. I thought about my father, about the years he'd walked these same lines, making sure the land stayed whole. I thought about how easy it would have been to let frustration take over, to meet the trespasser's demand with my own loud anger. But anger fades. Paperwork doesn't. The land was quiet again, the way it had been before I discovered the trespass. The pines whispered in the wind, the soil rested under its blanket of frost, and the creek at the far edge murmured its way toward the river. Life returned to its old rhythm, each day unfolding without intrusion. I knew the story of the man in the clearing would make its way through the county, carried in small-town conversations at the feed store or the diner. Maybe folks would frame it as a warning. Or maybe they'd just nod knowingly at the idea that some people can't help but push where they don't belong. Either way, the ending was the same. The land was mine, the house was empty, and the law had spoken without a single hammer being swung. Some victories are loud, but the best ones are quiet, the kind where the other man walks away on his own, carrying the weight of his mistake. And as I turned to head back toward my own house, the winter sun breaking through the clouds, I felt that steady, grounded peace again. The kind you only get when the soil under your boots is truly your own.